warning nobody took seriously. Just days before the basketball world was thrown into shock, Brandon Clarke said something that now feels almost impossible to ignore. At the time, nobody paid attention to it. It sounded like another injured NBA player talking about life, pressure, and uncertainty. Nothing unusual, nothing alarming. But after news of his sudden death spread across social media, fans immediately went back to that interview, and suddenly every word sounded different. I just hope to stay in the league as long as I can. The outside world ain't safe. Those weren't just random comments anymore. Those words became the center of one of the most disturbing conversations NBA fans have had all year. Because within hours of the tragic reports surrounding Brandon Clarke's passing, clips from that interview exploded online. Millions of fans started replaying the footage, slowing it down, analyzing his facial expressions, his tone, even the pauses between his sentences. Some people believe he looked exhausted. Others said he looked scared. And suddenly, the internet was asking a question nobody expected to ask about one of the Memphis Grizzlies' most respected players. Did Brandon Clarke know something was going wrong long before everyone else did? The story became even more emotional because Brandon Clarke was never viewed as a controversial NBA star. He wasn't constantly in headlines for drama. He wasn't one of those players chasing attention online every single week. He was known as the hard-working guy, the reliable teammate, the energy player every team needs in the playoffs. That's why the news hit different. One minute, fans were talking about off-season moves, playoff matchups, and free agency rumors. The next minute, timelines across social media were filled with photos of Brandon Clarke smiling in a Grizzlies jersey, while fans tried to process what had just happened. And then the reports started getting darker. According to multiple reports, authorities were investigating the possibility of an overdose after emergency responders arrived at a home in the San Fernando Valley area of Los Angeles. Officials also reportedly stated there were no immediate signs of foul play. Still, many details surrounding the situation remained unclear. That uncertainty only intensified the reactions online, because people weren't just reacting to the tragedy itself, they were reacting to the timeline. The injuries, the pressure, the arrest weeks earlier, the interview, the feeling that maybe something behind the scenes had been unraveling for a long time. And the scariest part, some fans now believe Brandon Clarke may have been quietly asking for help without anyone fully realizing it. This is the story of one of the NBA's most respected role players. A player who went from overlooked prospect to Memphis fan favorite to signing a $52 million contract extension. A player who helped build the Grizzlies into one of the most dangerous young teams in basketball. And a player whose final months became surrounded by questions nobody saw coming. But before we go deeper into everything that happened, comment below and let me know where you're watching from today. And if you remember Brandon Clarke during those intense Memphis playoff runs, press 1-inch the comments right now. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because the deeper this story goes, the more heartbreaking it becomes. The NBA dream nobody expected. Long before Brandon Clarke became a recognizable name in the NBA, he was just another overlooked kid trying to prove he belonged. No 5-star ranking, no massive high school hype, no nonstop ESPN coverage following him around the country. In fact, most major college programs barely paid attention to him at all. And honestly, that became the story of Brandon Clarke's entire career. People kept underestimating him. Born in Vancouver, Canada, before moving to Phoenix, Arizona at a young age, Clarke grew up far away from the spotlight that usually surrounds future NBA stars. He wasn't the player sneaker companies were chasing. He wasn't the athlete dominating viral mixtapes online. He was simply a hardworking basketball player trying to survive every level thrown at him. And that chip on his shoulder never left. At Desert Vista High School in Phoenix, Clarke showed flashes of incredible athleticism and defensive instincts, but recruiters still questioned whether he was truly NBA material. He was considered undersized for a big man. Too raw offensively, not polished enough. To many scouts, he looked like a player with energy, not a future professional. That doubt followed him into college recruitment. While future stars were committing to powerhouse schools like Duke, Kentucky, or Kansas, Brandon Clarke had to take a completely different road. He committed to San Jose State, a program that almost nobody expected to produce NBA talent. And that decision would quietly shape everything that came next. Because San Jose State forced Brandon Clarke to develop the hard way. Nothing was handed to him. No celebrity treatment. No national atención. No guaranteed future. As a freshman, he mostly came off the bench. But even then, coaches noticed something different about him. Every loose ball mattered. Every rebound became personal. Every defensive possession looked like he was trying to prove an entire generation of scouts wrong. He played with desperation, like someone terrified of losing the opportunity he had fought so hard to get. And slowly, people started noticing. By his sophomore season, Clarke transformed into one of the most explosive players in the conference. He became a defensive nightmare. Shot blocking, transition finishes, putback dunks, energy plays that completely changed games. Suddenly, the same basketball world that ignored him in high school was starting to pay attention. But Brandon Clarke still wanted more, because deep down, he knew San Jose State wasn't big enough for the dream he was chasing. He didn't just want to make highlight plays, he wanted the NBA, and getting there meant betting on himself one more time. That's when he made the biggest decision of his basketball life. He transferred to Gonzaga. At the time, it was a massive risk. Bigger competition, bigger expectations, national television, NBA scouts watching every move, and worst of all, he had to sit out an entire season because of NCAA transfer rule. For many players, losing a full year destroys momentum. Some athletes never recover mentally from it, but Brandon Clarke used that year different. While fans forgot about him, he disappeared into the gym. And when he finally came back, the basketball world was about to discover a completely different version of Brandon Clarke, a version nobody saw coming. Gonzaga turned him into a monster. When Brandon Clarke finally stepped onto the floor for Gonzaga, it took the basketball world less than a few games to realize something terrifying. This wasn't the same overlooked player from San Jose State anymore. This was a problem. The redshirt season changed everything. For an entire year, Clarke sat on the sidelines, watching, studying, and rebuilding his body, while Gonzaga continued growing into one of the most respected programs in college basketball. Most fans barely talked about him during that period. NBA conversations focused on bigger names, bigger schools, bigger stars. But inside Gonzaga's gym, coaches were watching Brandon Clarke evolve into something completely different. Stronger, faster, more explosive, and mentally tougher than ever before. By the time the 2018-2019 season started, Clarke looked like a player operating at a completely different speed than everyone else on the court. He wasn't just blocking shots. He was erasing possessions. He wasn't just finishing near the rim. He was attacking defenders like every dunk carried years of frustration behind it. And game after game, the hype around Gonzaga kept growing. Led by stars like Rui Hachimura and surrounded by future NBA talent, the Bulldogs quickly became one of the most dangerous teams in the country. But even on a loaded roster, Brandon Clarke somehow stood out because his energy never stopped. Every rebound looked violent, every fast break looked personal, every defensive rotation looked like survival. NBA scouts became obsessed with him almost overnight. Analysts started calling him one of the most impactful two-way players in college basketball. Suddenly, the same player who couldn't get major scholarship offers in high school was climbing NBA draft boards at an insane pace. And then came the performance that changed everything forever. March 23rd, 2019, NCAA tournament, Gonzaga versus Baylor. That night, Brandon Clarke delivered one of the most unforgettable performances college basketball had seen in years. 36 points, 8 rebounds, 5 blocks, 3 assists. He dominated the game from beginning to end like a man possessed. The performance became historic almost instantly because Brandon Clarke joined a list that barely even sounds real. According to NCAA records, only Shaquille O'Neal and David Robinson had ever recorded a tournament game with at least 35 points and 5 blocks before Clarke did it. Think about that for a second. A player who was once ignored by major programs suddenly had his name mentioned next to 2 all-time basketball legends. And from that moment forward, Brandon Clarke stopped being viewed as a good college player. Now he looked like a future NBA difference maker. The craziest part? He still didn't carry himself like a superstar. Teammates described him as humble, quiet, easy to root for. Coaches trusted him because he played every possession harder than almost anyone in the country. Fans loved him because he looked real. No fake personality, no manufactured image, just effort. Pur effort. That Gonzaga season transformed Brandon Clarke into one of the biggest success stories in basketball. He went from overlooked recruit to All-American to first-round NBA prospect in barely over a year. But while fans were celebrating his rise, very few people realized how much pressure was already building underneath the surface. Because for athletes like Brandon Clarke, the climb to the top can become dangerous, especially when basketball becomes more than a game, especially when your entire identity depends on staying there. And soon, the NBA was about to become his biggest test yet. Memphis found their perfect glue guy. By the time Brandon Clarke entered the NBA, people finally started paying attention. The Memphis Grizzlies selected him as part of their new generation alongside Ja Morant, and almost immediately, fans saw something special in him. Not because he was flashy, not because he chased attention, but because he played harder than almost everyone on the floor. Summer League was the first warning sign. While other rookies treated the games casually, Clarke attacked every possession like his career depended on it. Rebounds, blocks, hustle plays, energy that completely changed games. And by the end of the tournament, he won Summer League MVP while helping Memphis capture the championship. Suddenly, Grizzlies fans believed they had found the perfect piece next to Ja Morant. During his rookie season, Clarke quickly became one of Memphis's most trusted players. He wasn't the star of the team, but he became the type of player every contender needs. The glue guy, the player willing to do the dirty work, the one diving for loose balls, protecting the rim, and bringing energy every single night. Fans loved him because everything about him felt real. No drama, no ego, just effort. As the Grizzlies started rising into one of the most exciting young teams in basketball, Brandon Clarke quietly became one of the emotional engines behind their success. And for the first time in his life, it finally looked like everything was working out. But in the NBA, things can change fast. Sometimes faster than anyone is prepared for. The last good days before everything changed. For a while, it honestly looked like the Memphis Grizzlies were building something special. The energy around the team was different. FedEx Forum was loud again. Ja Morant was becoming one of the biggest young stars in basketball. And around him, Memphis had built a roster full of toughness, speed, and hunger. They weren't just winning games anymore. They were becoming a problem in the Western Conference. And right in the middle of it all was Brandon Clarke. He wasn't the face of the franchise. But inside the locker room, his value was impossible to ignore. Every championship-level team needs players like him, the guys willing to sacrifice stats for wins, the players doing all the exhausting work casual fans never fully appreciate, setting screens, fighting for rebounds, protecting the paint, changing momentum with effort alone. That became Brandon Clarke's identity in Memphis, and during the Grizzlies' breakout 2021-2022 season, he played some of the best basketball of his career. Memphis finished with 56 wins, the best regular season record in franchise history at the time. Suddenly, the Grizzlies weren't viewed as a rebuilding team anymore. Now they look dangerous, young, fearless, and capable of making a real playoff run. Brandon Clarke became one of the most important pieces of that success, especially in the playoffs. Every time the pace became chaotic, every time games turned physical, Clarke seemed to get stronger. Against Minnesota, he played with nonstop energy, crashing the glass and finishing around the rim like every possession mattered more than the last. Fans started calling him one of the most underrated role players in basketball. And honestly, they were right. Because while superstars grab headlines, playoff series are often decided by players exactly like Brandon Clarke. Players willing to outwork everybody else. The Grizzlies saw that value too. That's why, in 2022, Memphis rewarded him with a massive 4-year contract extension worth over $50 million. For Brandon Clarke, it was the moment everything finally came together. The overlooked high school player had made it. The doubted college recruit had made it. The kid nobody expected to reach the NBA had secured generational money and become part of the future of one of the league's fastest rising teams. And the craziest part, people around him said success never changed him. Teammates respected him because he stayed humble. Coaches trusted him because he never stopped working. Fans loved him because he carried himself like someone who still remembered exactly how hard the journey had been. From the outside, Brandon Clarke's life looked perfect. NBA contract, playoff success, league-wide respect, a bright future ahead. But sometimes, the most dangerous moments in life happen right after everything finally starts going right, because nobody realized it yet. But Brandon Clarke was about to enter the hardest period of his entire career. And once it started, nothing would ever feel the same again. The injury that changed everything. March 3rd, 2023. At first, it didn't look like the kind of moment that changes a career forever. The Grizzlies were facing the Denver Nuggets in a high-energy Western Conference matchup when Brandon Clarke suddenly went down with a leg injury just minutes into the game. Players stopped moving. Teammates looked concerned immediately. And deep down, athletes know sometimes your body tells you the truth before doctors ever do. The next day, Memphis confirmed the nightmare. Brandon Clarke had torn his Achilles. Season over, and just like that, everything changed. For most people watching at home, an Achilles injury sounds like another sports headline. But inside professional basketball, players understand how terrifying it really is. Because an Achilles tear doesn't just damage your body, it attacks your identity, especially for someone like Brandon Clarke. His entire game depended on explosiveness, quick jumps, fast reactions, endless energy. He wasn't dominating games with elite shooting or flashy isolation scoring. He survived through athleticism and effort. And suddenly, the thing that made him special was gone. Rehab became his new reality. No packed arenas, no playoff atmosphere, no roaring crowds, just long days inside training facilities trying to convince his body to cooperate again, hour after hour, week after week, month after month. And mentally, that process destroys a lot of athletes. Because while the league keeps moving forward, injured players often feel forgotten. The games continue without you. New stars appear. Fans stop talking about you. And eventually, some players begin questioning who they are without basketball. That's the part people rarely see. The loneliness, the fear, the silence. Brandon Clarke spent months fighting to come back, but the road never became easier. After missing significant time recovering from the Achilles injury, he struggled to fully regain the same explosiveness that once made him one of Memphis's most impactful players. And before he could fully stabilize his career again, more injuries came, knee problems, calf issues, setback after setback. Every time momentum started returning, something else seemed to go wrong. Over the next 3 seasons, Clarke missed enormous stretches of basketball. The player who once looked like one of the NBA's most reliable glue guys was now spending more time in recovery than on the court. And whether fans realized it or not, that changes a person, because professional athletes are taught from childhood that their value comes from performance, from winning, from staying available, from producing results no matter what their bodies feel like. So what happens when your body stops cooperating? What happens when the game you dedicated your entire life to slowly starts slipping away? That's when pressure becomes dangerous. Not just physical pressure, mental pressure, emotional pressure, the pressure of trying to hold on to the only life you've ever known. And looking back now, many fans believe this was the beginning of Brandon Clarke's silent collapse. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, behind the scene. One injury at a time, the silent collapse. At some point, Brandon Clarke stopped looking like the same player fans remembered from Memphis's playoff run. Not completely. The effort was still there. The professionalism was still there. But something felt different. The explosiveness that once made him so dangerous around the rim started fading. The second jumps weren't as quick anymore. The energy that used to overwhelm opponents now came in flashes instead of full games. And in the NBA, people notice those changes immediately because the league moves fast, brutally fast. One year, you're viewed as an essential piece of a contender. The next year, conversations start changing. Questions start appearing. Can he stay healthy? Will he ever return to form? Is the contract still worth it? That's the unforgiving reality of professional sports. And while fans debated his future online, Brandon Clarke was still trying to fight his way back physically and mentally at the same time. But the setbacks kept coming. After returning from the Achilles injury, he dealt with more knee problems. Then came another injury setback that forced him off the floor again. Every rehab process seemed to lead directly into another one. It became a cycle: recovery, hope, setback, repeat. And eventually, even the strongest athletes begin feeling trapped inside that cycle, especially when basketball has been your identity for your entire life. People outside sports sometimes underestimate how isolating injuries can become for professional athletes. Your teammates travel without you. The cameras disappear. Fans stop talking about your game and start talking about your future instead. You go from feeling important every night to feeling replaceable, and for a player like Brandon Clarke, that psychological pressure may have been even heavier because of how hard he worked to reach the NBA in the first place. Nothing about his career was guaranteed. He fought for every opportunity, every contract, every minute on the floor, which makes losing it even harder emotionally. By the 2025-2026 season, the situation had become difficult to ignore. Clarke was barely able to stay on the court, appearing in only a handful of games before suffering another setback that ended his season once again. Meanwhile, the Grizzlies themselves were changing too. The excitement surrounding the young core no longer felt the same. Injuries, roster changes, and inconsistency had started pulling the team apart. The championship energy Memphis once carried was fading fast, and Brandon Clarke, once viewed as one of the emotional leaders of that movement, now found himself watching most of it from the sideline. That alone can break athletes mentally. Watching the game continue without you. Watching younger players take opportunities you used to own. Watching your future slowly become uncertain. But then, everything became even more serious. Because in April of 2026, Brandon Clarke suddenly found himself making headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with basketball. And for many NBA fans, it was the first sign that something deeper might have been happening behind the scene: the arrest. That shocked NBA fans. By April 2026, Brandon Clarke was already fighting one of the hardest stretches of his career. The injuries had piled up, his future in the league suddenly felt uncertain, and fans were barely seeing him on the court anymore. But then, out of nowhere, the story took a turn nobody expected. Brandon Clarke was arrested in Arkansas. The news spread across social media almost instantly. At first, many fans thought it had to be fake. Brandon Clarke wasn't known as a troublemaker. He wasn't constantly involved in controversy. Around the league, he had built a reputation as one of the more respected and hard-working players in Memphis. That's why the headlines felt so shocking. According to reports at the time, Clarke was facing multiple charges connected to speeding and possession of a controlled substance after an incident involving law enforcement. Additional reports also mentioned allegations involving fleeing authorities and trafficking-related charges. Almost immediately, NBA fans began reacting online, not with anger at first, with confusion, because to many people, this simply didn't match the image they had of Brandon Clarke. This was the same player teammates described as humble and supportive. The same player who spent time giving back to local communities. The same player fans once viewed as one of the emotional glue guys behind Memphis's rise. So what happened? That became the question spreading everywhere online. Some fans blamed the pressure of injuries. Others believed the mental side of professional sports had finally become overwhelming. A few people even started revisiting older interviews and social media posts, wondering if there had been warning signs nobody noticed in real time. And looking back now, that arrest feels different than it did at the time, because only weeks later, the basketball world would receive devastating news that completely changed the way fans viewed those final months of Brandon Clarke's life. What's especially haunting is how fast everything happened. One moment, the conversation was about whether he could revive his NBA career. The next, people were discussing legal trouble, emotional stress, and uncertainty surrounding his future. For professional athletes, public pressure can become suffocating very quickly. Every setback becomes a headline. Every mistake becomes content. Every struggle becomes public debate. And while nobody fully knows what Brandon Clarke may have been dealing with privately during that period, many fans now believe the pressure surrounding his career, injuries, and public image had reached an extremely difficult point. Still, nobody imagined the story was heading toward tragedy. Not this quickly. Not like this. Because less than 2 months after the arrest, the NBA world woke up to news that felt almost impossible to process. And suddenly, fans everywhere started replaying one particular interview over and over again. The interview where Brandon Clarke quietly said something that now feels chilling. The outside world ain't safe. The final days, when the news broke, the basketball world froze. Brandon Clarke was dead at 29 years old. Within minutes, social media filled with shock, heartbreak, and confusion. NBA fans, reporters, former teammates, and players across the league were all trying to understand how someone so young, respected, and talented could suddenly be gone. And almost immediately, people went back to the interview. The clips spread everywhere. I just hope to stay in the league as long as I can. The outside world ain't safe. At the time, those words sounded ordinary. But after his death, they felt different, heavier, almost haunting. According to reports, emergency responders arrived at a home in the San Fernando Valley after a medical emergency call. Authorities said there were no immediate signs of foul play, while several reports stated investigators were looking into the possibility of an overdose. The full circumstances were still unclear. That uncertainty made the reaction even more emotional, because fans weren't just grieving Brandon Clarke the player. They were grieving the person behind the jersey, the overlooked kid who fought his way into the NBA, the humble teammate who earned respect without chasing attention, the player who helped build Memphis into one of the league's most exciting young teams. Soon, old clips began resurfacing. Gonzaga highlights, Grizzlies playoff moments, locker room videos. Fans remembered his energy, his smile, his hustle, and the way he played every possession like it mattered. And that's what made the tragedy so painful. Brandon Clarke's image was never built on chaos. It was built on effort, humility, persistence. But looking back now, many fans believe the injuries, the pressure, the setbacks, and the uncertainty may have been heavier than anyone understood. That is why his final interview still haunts people. Not because he predicted the future, but because his words now sound like a man carrying more than the world realized. And by the time people truly listened, it was already too late. The real lesson behind Brandon Clarke's story. At the end of the day, Brandon Clarke's story is bigger than basketball. Yes, fans will remember the highlights, the block shots, the playoff energy, the nights he helped Memphis outwork teams that were more talented on paper. But that's not the part people are thinking about now. What people remember most is how quickly everything changed. One moment, Brandon Clarke looked like part of the future of the NBA. The next, he was fighting injuries, uncertainty, and pressure that very few people outside professional sports can truly understand. And maybe that's the hardest truth about sports. Fans see the games, they see the contracts, they see the fame, but they rarely see what athletes carry emotionally behind the scene. The fear of losing everything, the pressure to stay relevant, the loneliness that comes with injuries and setbacks. For years, Brandon Clarke built his life around basketball. Every level of his journey required him to fight harder than the people around him. He fought to earn scholarships, fought to earn minutes, fought to earn respect, fought to stay in the NBA. And sometimes, people forget how exhausting that fight can become mentally, especially when injuries begin taking away the thing that gave your life structure and identity. That's why Brandon Clarke's story has connected emotionally with so many fans across the basketball world. Because underneath the NBA headlines was a human being, a teammate people respected, a player who worked for everything he earned, a person who gave back to the community and stayed humble even after reaching the highest level of basketball. And regardless of how fans remember his career, that legacy mattered. Maybe the biggest lesson from this story is that athletes are still human beings long after the cameras turn off. They feel pressure, fear, frustration, uncertainty, and sometimes those struggles remain invisible until it's far too late. That's why conversations around mental health, recovery, and emotional support inside professional sports matter more now than ever before. Because behind every jersey is a real person trying to survive expectations the outside world often cannot fully understand. Brandon Clarke's basketball journey may have ended far too soon, but the impact he left on teammates, fans, and the Memphis community will not disappear. And for many NBA fans, he will always be remembered as one of the hardest working and most respected players of his era. Rest in peace, Brandon Clarke. And if this story impacted you in any way, make sure you subscribe to the channel, leave a comment below, and share this video with other NBA fans who remember Brandon Clarke's journey. Also, comment 1 below if you'll always remember his Memphis playoff year. Because sometimes the players who never demanded attention leave behind the strongest memory.